The stench of rotting donkeys bloating in ditches forced lime crews to scatter ash by the basket, their vinegar-soaked cloths pressed tight against faces that had already seen too much. For 34 months, the world's fate would be decided by who could endure hunger longer, and in this calculus of suffering, Saladin held both the advantage and the curse of fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously. Acre wasn't merely a siege, it was a furnace, where will was smelted to steel, and whoever emerged would reshape the destiny of 3 continents. From his mobile headquarters near Tel al-Ayadiyah, roughly 3 to 4 kilometers from Acre's walls, Sultan Ala al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Franks as Saladin, could taste the salt spray carried on night winds and hear the distant clang of hammers on crampons as enemy sappers worked their tunnels. His beacon fires flickered against the darkness, visible from the city walls where his own men watched and waited. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had conquered Jerusalem and shattered the Crusader host at Fine now found himself trapped in history's most peculiar military geometry, a double siege where his forces encircled the Frankish camps, while those same Crusaders strangled Acre itself. This was no ordinary blockade. When the first Crusader forces had arrived on August 28, 1189, Saladin had expected another swift campaign, like those that had brought him Egypt, Damascus, and the Holy City itself. Instead, the Franks had dug in like ticks, creating a festering wound that consumed men, gold, and time in equal measure. Their entrenchments formed an iron noose around Acre's throat, 2 main trenches studded with wicker gabions and pavises, roughly 2.5 to 3 meters apart, extending from the harbour to the inland hills like the arms of some massive siege engine, designed to squeeze the life from stone and mortar. But Saladin's true genius lay in recognizing what his emirs could not. Acre was the lock on the entire Ayyubid maritime flank. Lose this coastal fortress, and the chain of Muslim ports from Tyre to Ascalon would crumble like dominoes in a child's game. Every dawn, when he rode the muddy ramparts before first prayer, his beard rhymed with dew, tasting flour from supply sacks to check for rot, he wasn't just inspecting defences, he was holding together an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. His war council at Safed in late 1189 had revealed the fault lines in Ayyubid's strategy. Most emirs urged patience, waiting for winter rains and dysentery to do what cavalry charges could not. They spoke of attrition as if it were a sword that cut only one way, forgetting that siege warfare devoured besiegers and besieged with equal appetite. Saladin had shifted tactics accordingly, abandoning rapid counterattacks for a more patient game, cavalry screens of 3,000 to 5,000 horse harassing Crusader foragers, supply trains moving at night from Damascus and the Jezreel Valley, pack animals loaded with grain, dates, and barley threading through darkness to avoid the lantern signals of Frankish galleys patrolling the harbour. The mathematical brutality of siege logistics consumed his days. Water discipline demanded that each cavalryman's kirba hold 3 to 4 litres, with patrols rationed to 1 skin per man per day during summer months. Horses suffered on 3 to 4 kilograms of barley daily when winter fodder spoiled, reducing the shock power of his mounted arm just when he needed it most. Remount lines stayed 2 to 3 hours behind the front lines, far enough to avoid Frankish raids but close enough to replace mounts crippled by arrows or exhaustion. The sounds of war had become a constant symphony that no amount of prayer could silence. Manjanic crews on the seaside bastions counted beats 1, 2, 3 to align their 40 to 80 kilogram stones with harbour swells that lifted targets into perfect impact. The smell of naft and vinegar-soaked rags clung to the hands of his naphtha crews, who worked in quilted, oil-splashed coats that reeked of pitch and imminent death. When Crusader siege towers dragged close enough to threaten the walls, these same crews launched clay pots filled with liquid fire that turned wet hides into hissing meat and reduced months of carpentry to ash in minutes. But it was the small details that revealed the true cost of this grinding warfare. Dysentery tore through both camps with democratic cruelty. His own mukanas, the latrine diggers, earned hazard bonuses for keeping trenches from overflowing after night rains, while Ibn al-Athir's chronicles spoke of stinking pits and summer rot that made strong men weep. Medical tents near the Sultan's pavilion brewed fenugreek and vinegar, while surgeons heated cautery irons in brazier coals that smelled of horsehair and olive oil, preparing for the daily harvest of broken bodies that siege warfare yielded like some grim agricultural cycle. The garrison inside Acre communicated through shield flashes at noon and coloured pennons at sunset, a visual language of desperation that Saladin read like scripture. 3 red flags from the Tower of Flies meant grain supplies had dropped below 10 days, a message that could trigger everything from diplomatic negotiations to suicide attacks, depending on what other pieces moved across this vast chessboard of stone and steel. Every night, as he walked beneath the cedar trees with his chief of staff Hans Bedell and naval advisor Friedrich Ruger, discussing matters too sensitive for formal war councils, Saladin calculated the terrible arithmetic of endurance. His spies inside the Crusader lines counted 50 to 60,000 mouths to feed, with 10 to 12,000 effective heavy infantry and 4 to 6,000 knights numbers that meant enemy supply requirements exceeded his own by margins that made every intercepted grain ship a strategic victory. Can you imagine standing in Saladin's boots, feeling the weight of an empire pressing down on your shoulders while the Mediterranean wind carried the screams of dying men from 3 directions at once? The autumn of 1189 was ending, and somewhere beyond the horizon, new Crusader fleets were gathering fleets that would bring not just reinforcements, but the kind of political pressure that could shatter alliances and topple dynasties, leaving the fate of the Holy Land hanging by threads thinner than a spider's web. If you're finding yourself drawn into this medieval world of calculated brutality and strategic genius, hit that like button and subscribe. I'm writing this from my studio in Los Angeles at 10:47 p.m., and your support helps me dive deeper into these forgotten corners of history. Drop a comment about which aspect of medieval siege warfare surprises you most. The crack of canvas splitting under strain echoed across Blackwater as Ayyubid galleys broke from their harbour moorings, steering by moonless skies toward the Crusader blockade that choked Acre's lifeline to the sea. Naval warfare in the eastern Mediterranean wasn't about grand fleet battles. It was about threading the needle between survival and starvation, where a single grain ship could mean the difference between holding a siege and watching 30,000 men dissolve into the countryside like salt in rain. Saladin's admirals understood that controlling the sea lanes meant controlling the war itself, and they fought with the desperate creativity of men who knew that every failed blockade run brought Acre one day closer to surrender. The Ayyubid fleet, a patchwork of Egyptian and Syrian ships, commanded by men who had learned seamanship in the tideless waters of the Nile and the rocky harbours of Latakia, faced an enemy that owned the horizon. Frankish galleys patrolled in systematic patterns, their lantern signals creating a web of light that could turn any approaching Muslim vessel into a floating pyre within minutes. Yet 3 times in 1190 and 1191, Saladin's naval commanders attempted major blockade runs, gambling everything on wind, darkness, and the kind of maritime audacity that had once made Arab dhows the masters of the Indian Ocean. The key lay in timing and deception. When northwesterlies blew after noon, Muslim galleys could hug the lee of the harbour mole, sprinting 300 to 400 metres into Acre's inner harbour, under the cover of arrow screens fired from the Tower of Flies. The fortress served as both wind gauge and tactical anchor. When its weathered stones caught the afternoon light at the correct angle, it meant the breeze would mask the sound of oars cutting water and give approaching ships those precious minutes needed to slip past the Crusader cordon. But October 4th, 1189, brought a different kind of naval warfare. The kind fought on land with horses and steel, when Saladin decided that the Frankish ring around Acre had grown fat and complacent enough to crack under pressure. The first major field battle outside the city walls began as a reconnaissance in force, but escalated into something that would haunt both armies through the long winter ahead. Dawn broke grey and humid, the kind of weather that made mail shirts stick to skin and turned leather grips slippery with sweat. Saladin's cavalry screens, roughly 4,000 strong, had been probing the eastern approaches to the Crusader camp for weeks, testing response times and mapping the maze of trenches, palisades, and horse lines that protected the besiegers from becoming the besieged. What they discovered was a vulnerability that no amount of engineering could fix. The Frankish left flank relied on a marshy depression that channeled approaches into predictable corridors, perfect killing grounds if you had the mobility to exploit them. The Muslim battle plan unfolded like a hunting formation scaled up to military proportions. Light cavalry swept wide through the morning mist, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft ground left from recent rains. Heavy cavalry, the Mamluks, and Turkish horse archers who formed the spine of Saladin's mobile army, waited in reserve, while mounted archers moved into position along ridgelines that commanded the approaches to the Crusader. Entrenchments. The smell of horse sweat and leather oil mixed with the metallic tang of weapons freshly honed on whetstones, creating that distinctive battlefield perfume that veterans could recognize from a mile away. When the envelopment began, It started with dust clouds and the distant music of camel bells, a psychological touch that Saladin's commanders used to mask the real direction of attack, while unnerving enemies who associated those sounds with raids and slavery. The Crusader left wing, anchored by a mixed force of French knights and Pisan crossbowmen, found itself facing what appeared to be a frontal demonstration, while the real threat materialized on their flanks like a nightmare made of steel and horsehair. But the Franks weren't the same men who had been surprised at Haltine. These were veterans of 2 years' siege warfare, hardened by dysentery and sharpened by constant skirmishing. When Muslim cavalry surged around their exposed wing, they didn't break, they bent, falling back on prepared positions while their crossbowmen poured bolts into the advancing horsemen with mechanical precision. What should have been a rout became a grinding melee that stretched across trampled barley fields, already buzzing with flies attracted by the stench of death. The afternoon countercharge came when dust and confusion reached their peak. Crusader heavy cavalry, led by knights who had learned hard lessons about timing and terrain, smashed into Saladin's pursuing horsemen, just as fatigue began to tell on both mounts and riders. The collision sounded like the world's largest blacksmith shop, collapsing the crash of iron on iron, the screaming of wounded horses, and the peculiar wet thud of maces finding gaps in armor, creating a symphony of violence that could be heard from Acre's walls 3 miles away. By sunset, both armies had fought each other to a bloody standstill and withdrawn to lick their wounds. The tactical result was inconclusive, but the strategic implications rippled through both camps like cracks in winter ice. Saladin's men had proven they could still challenge the Crusaders in open battle, but they had also revealed the limits of cavalry against prepared positions defended by disciplined infantry. The Franks had held their ground, but they had also burned through arrows, energy, and blood, at rates that made their commanders calculate how many more such victories they could afford. As darkness settled over the trampled battlefield, scavengers, both human and animal, began their grim harvest. The sound of men calling for water in 3 languages created a polyglot chorus of suffering that would haunt the survivors' dreams for months to come. Saladin rode among his wounded, distributing coins from his personal purse and words of comfort that carried more weight than gold, while his surgeons worked by torchlight to separate the savable from the lost. The war was entering a new phase, one where neither side could claim easy victories, and every tactical decision carried consequences that would echo through the remaining months of siege. But somewhere in the darkness beyond the battlefield, new players were moving forces that would transform this grinding war of attrition into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Winter was coming, and with it would come tests that would push both armies beyond the breaking point, forcing Saladin to make choices that would define not just the fate of Acre, but the future of his entire empire. Section 3. The Underground War. Engineers countermined by listening through bowls pressed to earth, their ears straining to catch the distant tap-tap-tap of iron picks biting into stone somewhere in the darkness beneath their feet. The siege of Acre was becoming 2 wars, one fought under the Mediterranean sun with horses and steel, another waged in claustrophobic tunnels where men died by suffocation, cave-in, or the peculiar terror of meeting an enemy's blade in spaces too narrow to swing a sword. Saladin understood that whoever controlled the underground would ultimately control the city above, and he threw his best engineers into a subterranean chess match that would test nerves, mathematics, and the fundamental question of whether stone walls meant anything, when the earth beneath them could be hollowed out like a rotten tooth. Winter 1189 to 1190 transformed the Crusader camp into a swamp that served Saladin's strategy better than a dozen cavalry charges. The seasonal rains turned their entrenchments into a maze of sucking mud that swallowed boots, bogged down supply carts, and created the kind of misery that broke men's spirits more efficiently than arrows. From his rotating command posts, Saladin's men could listen at night to the distinctive sound of Frankish boots pulling free from the mire, a wet, organic noise that became the soundtrack to psychological warfare conducted through patience rather than violence. The timing of cavalry raids shifted accordingly. When trumpet calls failed to sound through the muck, when sergeants couldn't form ranks because their men were ankle-deep in freezing slurry, that was when Saladin's light horse struck. These weren't charges meant to break the Crusader line. They were precision strikes designed to harvest a few more defenders, capture a supply wagon, or simply remind the besiegers that their fortress of mud and timber could become their tomb if winter lasted longer than their supplies. But it was below ground where the real war of nerves unfolded. Muslim sappers filled their tunnels with damp wool and smoke to trace cracks where Frankish engineers worked their own excavations. The technique required nerves of steel and lungs of leather men, would crawl through spaces barely wide enough for their shoulders, following smoke trails that might lead to enemy positions, or might simply dissipate into natural cave systems that honeycombed the limestone beneath Acre's foundations. When the smoke revealed a breach in an adjacent tunnel, the underground war became intensely personal. Knife fights in spaces where you could touch both walls with outstretched arms, and festooned, where the winner was often simply the man who could hold his breath longest while grappling in absolute darkness. The psychological aspects of tunnel warfare extended beyond the excavations themselves. One Ayyubid drummer developed a specialty that became legendary among both armies. He would beat a slow funeral rhythm on a water jar as sappers packed mining charges with deadly precision. The sound carried through stone and earth, creating a countdown to destruction that defenders could hear but not locate. When walls finally collapsed under these musical demolitions, Frankish soldiers would rush to plug the breach, only to discover that Saladin's engineers had filled the gap with dead sheep, a trap designed to waste the enemy's reserves and energy on meaningless objectives while real attacks developed elsewhere. Above ground, the garrison inside Acre maintained communication through an intricate system of visual signals that revealed the desperate mathematics of siege warfare. Shield flashes at noon carried different messages depending on the number and sequence. 3 quick flashes meant ammunition was adequate, 5 meant water reserves were dropping, while a sustained reflection lasting the full breadth of a man's shadow indicated that food stores had entered the critical phase. The coloured pennons at sunset added another layer of information. Yellow flags indicated morale remained high, red warned of political tensions within the garrison, while black pennons, the signal no commander wanted to send, meant the city was prepared to negotiate surrender. Saladin's intelligence network inside the Crusader camp provided daily updates that read like a logistics nightmare written in human suffering. His spies counted tents by torchlight, estimating 50 to 60,000 mouths to feed during the peak months of 1191, with effective fighting strength holding steady around 10 to 12,000 heavy infantry and 4 to 6,000 knights. But numbers told only part of the story. The real intelligence lay in tracking, which units received fresh supplies, which commanders met privately after evening prayers, and which sections of the camp showed signs of the kind of desperation that preceded either brilliant victories or catastrophic defeats. The religious dimension of the siege created its own psychological battlefield. Friday khutbahs in the Muslim camp invoked Jerusalem's capture in 1187 and the seizure of the True Cross at Attrition, with imams reciting Surah Al-Af before night assaults to steel the ranks for what might be their final earthly actions. But religion cut both ways. Ibn al-Athir noted rumours that Frankish camps used pig fat to waterproof their siege tower hides. Intelligence that Ayyubid imams transformed into sermons about ritual impurity that boosted morale for dawn-burn raids designed to cleanse the battlefield of such abominations. The arrival of news about Frederick Barbarossa's drowning on June 10th, 1190, shifted the strategic calculus in ways that rippled through both camps like stones thrown into still water. Saladin's envoys calculated that German survivors trickling into the theatre would number in the low thousands rather than the tens of thousands that the Holy Roman Emperor's reputation had promised. This intelligence freed Muslim commanders to focus their attention on the approaching Anglo-French forces, whose political weight and siege expertise posed threats that German numerical superiority could never match. The daily routines of siege warfare settled into rhythms that became almost ritualistic in their precision. Medical tents near Saladin's pavilion brewed their fenugreek and vinegar compounds, while surgeons counted pulses to 60 on prayer beads, timing bloodlettings with mathematical precision that mixed Islamic medicine with battlefield pragmatism. Armor maintenance became a constant concern. Lamella plates, mail shirts, and padded coats required daily attention in the salt air that corroded metal and rotted leather with democratic efficiency. Leather shields rimmed in rawhide stiffened like horn under the Mediterranean sun, while the process of waterproofing equipment with oil and wax created its own aromatic signature that clung to men's hands and clothes like perfume made from preparation for death. Can you imagine the psychological weight of knowing that every decision you made in those underground tunnels might determine whether 10,000 men lived to see another sunrise? But spring 1190 brought news that would transform this methodical siege into something far more dangerous. Intelligence about Crusader fleets gathering in Sicily and Cyprus, carrying not just reinforcements, but the kind of siege engines that could reduce the strongest walls to rubble in days rather than months. The sound of God's Own Catapult hurling stones the size of wine barrels could be heard 3 miles inland, each impact sending tremors through limestone bedrock that made horses shy and sleeping men jolt awake in their blankets. When Philip Augustus of France reached Acre on April 20th, 1191, followed by Richard Lionheart of England on June 8th, the mathematical nature of siege warfare shifted from patient arithmetic to explosive calculus. These weren't just reinforcements, they were mobile treasuries with the resources to build engines that could reduce stone walls to gravel in hours rather than months, and Saladin found himself facing a technological revolution that threatened to make his carefully constructed defences irrelevant. The political clock that arrived with the Western kings ticked with mechanical precision that Muslim commanders could hear in their sleep. Richard's siege engines bore names that doubled as psychological warfare. Malvoisin, Bad Neighbour, and God's Own Catapult represented more than military hardware. They embodied the kind of industrial approach to destruction that could transform 34 months of careful siegecraft into rubble-filled history. Saladin's scouts measured the Crusader lines with new urgency, noting how the eastern sector near marshy ground offered the best potential breach points, while calculating how long his own countermeasures could delay what increasingly looked like inevitable mathematical outcomes. From the Tower of Flies, the harbour fortress that served as both wind gauge and tactical anchor for Ayyubid naval operations, Muslim observers tracked the daily routine of Crusader trebuchets pounding what they called the accursed Malvoisin sector. 30 to 60 shots per day created a rhythm of destruction that forced Saladin to rotate wall watches to 90-minute shifts, reducing the arrow fatigue that accumulated when men spent too long staring at mechanical death approaching in perfect parabolas. The psychological impact of predictable destruction proved almost as corrosive as the physical damage defenders could calculate when the next stone would arrive, but remained powerless to prevent it. But Saladin's genius lay in recognizing that siege warfare was ultimately about logistics, not technology. While Richard's engineers assembled their mechanical marvels, Ayyubid supply trains continued their nightly journeys from Damascus and the Jezreel Valley, threading through darkness to deliver the grain, dates, and barley that kept 30,000 Muslim soldiers operational. Pack animals moved in formations designed to minimize losses to Frankish naval fire, with drivers using techniques perfected over centuries of desert warfare, reading wind patterns to predict when Crusader galleys might venture close to shore, timing crossings to coincide with moon phases that provided maximum concealment. The Ayyubid fleet's most audacious attempt to break the naval blockade came during this period, when Egyptian and Syrian ships coordinated their approach using intelligence gathered by swimmers who cut anchor ropes during storms. When two Crusader galleys flipped during a particularly violent Mediterranean squall, Muslim salvage teams worked by torchlight to haul enemy timbers ashore, transforming wrecked warships into mantlets by sunrise. The psychological impact of seeing their own wood protecting enemy positions created exactly the kind of demoralization that Saladin understood would prove more valuable than any tactical advantage the salvaged materials provided. Daily bread inside Acre had deteriorated to a mathematics of starvation that revealed the true cost of prolonged siege warfare. Coarse barley loaves, hand-sized when baking materials were adequate, had shrunk to portions that guards split 4 ways, dipping the fragments into garlicky broth that stretched diminishing protein sources to their absolute limits. Women carried amphorae to cisterns guarded by archers, counting steps 200 to 300 through alleys that snipers had turned into shooting galleries, where every water-gathering expedition became a calculated gamble with death. The underground war intensified accordingly. Saladin's engineers perfected their listening techniques, pressing bowls to earth while sappers worked in shifts that balanced the need for silence with the urgency of completing excavations before Crusader countermines intersected their tunnels. The psychological warfare of the funeral drummer reached new heights of sophistication. Different rhythms indicated different types of charges, while the timing of beats provided intelligence about when walls might collapse and where defenders should concentrate their response efforts. Storm season brought opportunities that required split-second decision-making and nerves that could function under pressure that broke ordinary men. When Mediterranean weather flipped 2 Crusader galleys at anchor, Muslim swimmers moved through darkness to cut anchor ropes and salvage what they could from vessels that represented months of Western shipbuilding expertise. By dawn, enemy planks had become friendly mantlets, while the psychological impact of transformation, seeing destruction converted to protection, provided morale benefits that couldn't be quantified in conventional military terms. Saladin's correspondence with Al-Qadi al-Fatil during this period reveals the constant negotiation mathematics that governed siege diplomacy. Prisoner exchanges proceeded in lots of 50 to 200, while proposals to return a portion of the True Cross in exchange for hostages created diplomatic complexities that usually stalled when either side calculated that military pressure might yield better terms than negotiated. Settlements. The True Cross itself had become a bargaining chip whose symbolic value exceeded its physical dimensions, representing Christian legitimacy in the Holy Land and Muslim proof of divine favor in ways that made rational negotiation nearly impossible. Pay chests counted dinars by weight, each mithqal representing roughly 4.25 grams of silver that translated into daily survival for men whose loyalty depended on receiving wages that arrived on schedule. Delayed stipends in spring 1191 led to murmurs among Turcoman auxiliaries, whose battlefield effectiveness dropped proportionally to their financial grievances. Saladin personally distributed coin to pacify these troops, understanding that a few extra dinars spent on morale could prevent the kind of mass desertion that would collapse his entire strategic position overnight. The sensory details of siege warfare created their own intelligence networks that experienced commanders learned to read like scripture. Night noises provided tactical information. Frog choruses indicated rising marshes that might bog down cavalry attacks, while the absence of dog barks from specific villages often preceded Frankish night marches through those corridors. The smell of pitch and vinegar from naphtha crews, mixed with the sound of whetstones on arrowheads, and the sweet smoky taste of date paste on dry bread, creating an olfactory signature that veterans could recognize from miles away. Can you imagine calculating the morale impact of every military decision while simultaneously managing supply chains that stretched from the Nile to Mesopotamia? But June 8th, 1191 brought more than just another Crusader king to the siege lines. Richard's arrival marked the beginning of the final phase, where political pressure, military technology, and human endurance would collide in ways that would determine not just Acre's fate, but the future balance of power between Christianity and Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean. News that Richard the Lionheart personally knocked a crossbow on July 11th, 1191, raced through both armies like wildfire, carrying the message that kings themselves were willing to shed blood for stones and mortar that had already consumed more treasure than most kingdoms saw in a decade. The mathematics of siege warfare had reached their inevitable conclusion, where human endurance collided with mechanical precision in ways that transformed tactical decisions into existential choices. Saladin watched from his ridge as Crusader trebuchets maintained their relentless rhythm against the accursed sector stones, weighing 40 to 80 kilograms, arcing through Mediterranean air with the precision of mechanical death, each impact sending limestone dust cascading from walls that had protected Acre since the days of the First Crusade. His engineers calculated that the city's defences could absorb perhaps another week of such punishment before critical structural failures would make the walls indefensible. Inside Acre, the final communications between garrison and relief force took on the desperate poetry of men who understood they were writing history with their own blood. 3 red flags from the Tower of Flies no longer meant grain reserves had dropped below 10 days. They meant the city had perhaps 48 hours before starvation forced surrender, regardless of military considerations. Shield flashes at noon carried messages too complex for simple reflection patterns. Sustained signals, indicating which sectors were ready to fight to the death, which commanders had lost effective control over their men, and which sections of wall remained structurally sound enough to support a final defensive stand. The sensory assault of the final siege phase created its own psychological battlefield that tested nerves more efficiently than arrows. The constant clang of hammer on crampon in the tunnels mixed with the vinegar sting of cleaning wounds, while the rasp of whetstones on arrowheads provided percussion for a symphony of preparation that everyone knew was reaching its crescendo. The sweet, smoky taste of date paste on dry bread became a luxury that marked the difference between units still receiving supplies and those operating on willpower alone. Saladin's final war council revealed the brutal calculus that governed military decision-making when political considerations collided with tactical reality. His correspondence with Al-Qadi al-Fatdil showed constant negotiation mathematics that had become increasingly desperate as Crusader pressure intensified. Prisoner exchanges in lots of 50 to 200 continued right up until the final hours, while proposals to return portions of the True Cross in exchange for hostages created diplomatic complexities that both sides understood were probably meaningless. The siege had developed its own momentum that negotiations couldn't stop. The psychological warfare of the final phase reached levels of sophistication that bordered on artistry. Saladin ordered his archers to shoot the banner, not the man, when Richard appeared on the walls, understanding that breaking symbols carried more strategic weight than killing individuals. The English king's personal involvement in the siege, knocking his own crossbow while standing within arrow range, represented exactly the kind of political theatre that could transform tactical victories into propaganda defeats if Muslim arrows found their mark. But it was the small details that revealed how close both armies had come to complete exhaustion. Water discipline had become so strict that patrols were rationed to single skins per man per day, even during the cool hours before dawn, while cavalry mounts showed the kind of hoof rot that resulted from standing in muddy picket lines for months without adequate rotation to dry ground. Farriers worked by torchlight, boiling hooves in brine and smearing tar while the smell of burned horn drifted across both camps like incense burned for the dead. A desert falcon that had nested on a shattered merlon became an unlikely mascot for the defenders, with archers feeding it scraps while calling it the Watcher. When the bird took flight, men on both sides swore that charges would follow, a piece of battlefield superstition that revealed how siege warfare had pushed human psychology beyond rational limits and into the realm of omens and desperate bargains with fortune. Medical discipline reflected the same kind of resource management that governed everything from ammunition distribution to horse fodder. Surgeons counted pulses to 60 on prayer beads, timing bloodlettings with mathematical precision that mixed Islamic medical theory with battlefield pragmatism, born of treating thousands of wounded men. Rosewater compresses and ground pomegranate peel were reserved for gut sickness, while common wounds received treatment that prioritized conservation of supplies over comfort, honey, and vinegar for cuts that might heal, cautery for wounds that required immediate closure, and prayer for everything else. The final 24 hours before Acre's capitulation on July 12, 1191, unfolded with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. Crusader trebuchets had opened breaches in the eastern wall that Muslim engineers could no longer repair faster than stones could widen them. Inside the city, civilian population had been reduced to bartering linens and spices for lamp oil, while water carriers counted steps to cisterns through alleys that snipers had turned into shooting galleries, where survival required the kind of luck that rational men couldn't count on indefinitely. The moment of surrender came not with dramatic gestures, but with the quiet mathematics of men who had calculated that further resistance would accomplish nothing except additional death. When the garrison commander raised the white banner from the Tower of Flies, both armies understood that 34 months of siege warfare had reached their conclusion, but the terms of that conclusion would determine whether Acre's fall represented a tactical setback or a strategic catastrophe for war. Saladin's entire position in the eastern Mediterranean. The surrender terms themselves reflected the complex diplomatic reality that had evolved during 34 months of grinding warfare. Some 2,700 Muslim prisoners would be handed over to Crusader custody, while negotiations for their ransom would continue according to schedules that everyone understood were probably optimistic. Saladin agreed to these terms knowing that time had become his most precious resource. Every day of negotiation was another day to reorganize his forces for the campaigns that everyone knew would follow Acre's fall. Can you imagine the weight of signing documents that would determine the fate of thousands of men whose only crime was fighting for the same cause you represented? But even as ink dried on surrender documents, both commanders understood that Acre's capitulation was not an ending but a transformation. The siege was over, but the war was about to enter a phase where political pressure and religious passion would drive events toward conclusions that would echo through history long after the last stone had been thrown. From Saladin's Ridge, the dust clouds rising from Ayadie on August 20th, 1191, were followed by drum beats that seemed to echo across the entire coastal plain, and then came a silence so profound it seemed to drain the colour from the Mediterranean sky. The ransom negotiations that followed Acre's surrender had proceeded with the methodical precision of merchants calculating the price of wheat, until Richard Lionheart transformed diplomacy into demonstration by ordering the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners. The message carried further than any siege engine could throw stones. This was no longer warfare, governed by the civilized mathematics of prisoner exchange and territorial negotiation. This was a conflict where political theatre required stages built from human corpses. Saladin watched the massacre from his command position roughly 4 kilometers inland, close enough to see the dust kicked up by marching formations, but far enough to be spared the individual details of systematic slaughter. His chroniclers recorded that the sounds carried on the sea breeze first, the rhythmic beating of Crusader drums maintaining execution pace, then the kind of silence that follows when large numbers of men stop breathing simultaneously. That quiet, hardened Ayyubid resolve in ways that no amount of battlefield oratory could have achieved, transforming what had been a strategic withdrawal into a personal blood debt that would define the remaining campaign season. The post-fall calculus required immediate strategic reorientation that would test every aspect of Saladin's military genius. Within 72 hours of Acre's surrender, he had begun pulling forces back to stronger inland positions 7 to 15 kilometers east, abandoning the static coastal defense strategy that had consumed 34 months and thousands of lives. The new approach prioritized cavalry mobility over fixed fortifications, recognizing that Richard's siege engines had rendered stone walls tactically obsolete, at least until Muslim engineers could develop countermeasures that matched Crusader technological advantages. This wasn't retreat, but transformation. Saladin's scouts had identified positions where natural terrain features ridgelines, dry wadis, and olive groves could channel Crusader advances into killing zones where mobility mattered more than masonry. The psychological impact of abandoning Acre's walls was balanced against the mathematical reality that defending every coastal fortress would disperse Ayyubid forces beyond effective concentration, allowing the Crusaders to defeat Muslim armies piecemeal through the kind of systematic reduction that had proven so effective against static defenses. The logistics audit that followed Acre's fall revealed both the cost of prolonged siege warfare and the foundation for continued resistance. Grain reserves in Damascus and Cairo required immediate reallocation to support forces that were no longer tied to fixed defensive positions, but would need supply trains capable of following mobile armies across terrain, where traditional depot systems couldn't function. Pay scales for horse archers rose by several dinars per month, an investment in retaining veterans whose battlefield experience had become irreplaceable after 34 months of continuous combat against the finest military forces that Western Europe could assemble. The Ayyubid naval strategy pivoted accordingly, abandoning attempts to break harbour blockades in favour of commerce raiding designed to disrupt Crusader supply lines between Acre and Jaffa. Light galleys harassed enemy cargo ships with tactical precision that aimed to reduce Richard's daily bread supply by a few hundred sacks per week, small margins that accumulated into strategic pressure when multiplied across the thousands of mouths that Crusader armies required feeding. This represented a fundamental shift from the defensive naval warfare that had characterized the siege to offensive operations designed to make every Frankish meal cost more than the enemy could afford indefinitely. Siege technology lessons learned during Acre's reduction prompted immediate changes in Ayyubid military procurement. More counterweight trebuchets were ordered from artisans in Aleppo and Hama, with craftsmen promised tax relief for a year if they could complete engines before the next campaign season began. The psychological impact of watching Crusader siege engines reduce supposedly impregnable walls to rubble had convinced Muslim commanders that technological parity was essential for future operations. Stone fortifications remained valuable, but only when supported by mechanical artillery capable of matching Western innovations. Cultural memory processing began immediately, with court poets comparing Acre's stones to martyrs' ribs, while Saladin's court reciters transformed the names of fallen emirs into rhymed lists suitable for evening gatherings. This wasn't mere literary exercise, but strategic morale management, creating narrative frameworks that contextualized tactical defeat within broader religious and cultural victories that maintained fighting spirit during the difficult months ahead. The human cost of the siege revealed itself in details that military histories often overlooked. Horses suffered from prolonged exposure to salt air and limited fodder, requiring months of rehabilitation before they could return to full military effectiveness. Veterans showed the psychological strain of sustained combat in ways that required careful management. Some had developed the kind of hypervigilance that made them valuable scouts but unreliable in formation fighting, while others had retreated into religious fatalism that made them fearless but difficult to control tactically. Daily discipline measures implemented during the siege became permanent features of Ayyubid military organization. The prohibition on looting friendly farms within 20 kilometers of camp continued, with violators still losing their mounts for 40 days, an economic penalty that proved more effective than physical punishment in maintaining the kind of local support that mobile warfare required. The system of gifting robes of honor after successful operations expanded to include recognition for non-combat achievements like engineering, intelligence gathering, and medical service. Water discipline that had been essential during the siege became standard procedure for desert warfare, with cavalrymen's water skins maintaining the 3 to 4 litre capacity that experience had proven optimal for day-long operations in Mediterranean heat. The techniques developed for reading night sounds, frog choruses, indicating rising water levels, absent dog barks suggesting enemy movement through specific corridors, were codified into intelligence procedures that scouts used to provide tactical warning for mobile operations. The administrative machinery that had supported 30,000 men during the siege was streamlined for forces that would operate in smaller, more dispersed formations. Supply trains learned to move in packets that could serve independent columns, while communication systems adapted from siege signaling were modified to coordinate cavalry operations across terrain, where visual contact between units might be impossible for days at a time. Medical procedures refined during the siege, counting pulses on prayer beads, rationing rosewater compresses, using ground pomegranate peel for specific types of wounds became standard battlefield medicine that traveling with mobile armies rather than static hospital tents. The psychological techniques that had maintained morale during months of siege warfare were adapted for the different stresses of mobile campaigning, where isolation and uncertainty replaced the grinding pressure of siege operations. Can you imagine the mental adjustment required to abandon defensive positions that had cost thousands of lives to maintain, trusting that mobility could achieve what stone walls could not? But even as Saladin reorganized his forces for the campaigns ahead, this intelligence reached him about Richard's intentions that suggested the Crusader king understood exactly what strategic advantages Acre's capture had provided and was prepared to exploit them with the same mechanical precision that had reduced the city's walls to rubble. The muezzin's call to dawn prayer merged with the clatter of silver dinars as Saladin sat on his low carpet, ring glinting in the early light, signing orders with a reed pen that smelled of galling Crusader, while calculating how to transform tactical defeat into strategic opportunity. The fall of Acre had stripped away 34 months of illusion, revealing the fundamental truth that would govern the remaining campaign season. This was no longer a war that could be won through patient siegecraft and defensive superiority, but a mobile conflict where victory would belong to whoever could adapt fastest to technologies and tactics that had made traditional fortification obsolete. Saladin faced a choice that would echo through the remaining years of his reign: continue fighting the last war, or reinvent his entire military approach before Richard's momentum became unstoppable. The tent city that housed 30,000 Muslim soldiers transformed itself with the efficiency of a desert caravan preparing to move. Lanes that had been named for origins during the siege, Street of the Jazeera, Lane of Cairo, became organizational tools for rapid deployment, allowing runners to find specific regiments quickly when red pennons signaling general alarm rose over the Sultan's command pole. The administrative machinery that had supported static siege operations was streamlined into mobile units capable of following cavalry columns across terrain where traditional supply depot systems couldn't function. Political strains that had simmered during the siege now required immediate attention. Aleppo's garrison had requested pay relief that reflected the broader economic pressure of maintaining multiple fronts, while Acre consumed resources at unsustainable rates. Saladin's solution demonstrated the political sophistication that had built his empire. Northern emirs were rotated south in 3 to 4 month tours, ensuring that no frontier felt abandoned while preventing any single commander from developing the kind of local power base that could threaten central authority. The rotation system also provided experienced officers with direct knowledge of Crusader tactics intelligence that would prove invaluable as the war entered its mobile phase. The strategic regret that would haunt Saladin's later years was already becoming apparent to his inner circle. Muslim chroniclers noted that the failure to crush the initial Crusader ring in 1189 had become a cautionary tale about allowing enemy bridgeheads to mature into permanent threats. The lesson was clear: mobile warfare required swift decision-making that prevented enemies from establishing the kind of logistical base that had made Acre's reduction possible. Future operations would prioritize rapid response over patient siegecraft, even if this meant accepting higher casualty rates in exchange for strategic tempo. Religious life continued to provide both spiritual comfort and practical morale management. Quran recitations in mosques inside captured towns, mixed with pre-battle invocations that echoed across fields still buzzing with flies attracted by the detritus of war. The psychological impact of Friday khutbahs that invoked Jerusalem's capture and the seizure of the True Cross created shared narrative frameworks that maintained unit cohesion, even when tactical situations deteriorated. Imams understood that their role extended beyond spiritual guidance. to include the kind of morale maintenance that kept armies functional under pressures that broke ordinary men. Armor maintenance became a daily ritual that revealed both the practical requirements of sustained warfare and the economic pressures facing individual soldiers. Lamella plates required constant attention in salt air that corroded metal with democratic efficiency, while mail shirts and padded coats needed cleaning and repair that consumed time and resources that mobile operations couldn't always provide. Leather shields rimmed in rawhide stiffened like horn under Mediterranean sun, requiring daily treatment with oils that had to be transported along with arrows, fodder, and medical supplies in supply trains that grew heavier with every practical requirement that experience had proven essential. Weather patterns provided tactical advantages that experienced commanders learned to exploit with scientific precision. Afternoon sea breezes favored Muslim arrows fired from west-facing positions, while the timing of bowstring maintenance waxed at noon and unstrung at night reflected the kind of technical knowledge that accumulated through months of constant skirmishing. The psychological impact of mechanical precision in weapons maintenance created confidence that translated directly into battlefield effectiveness when men understood that their equipment would function reliably under pressure. Daily discipline measures implemented during the siege became permanent features of military organization that would define Ayyubid armies for the remainder of Saladin's reign. The prohibition on looting friendly farms within 20 kilometers of camp continued with violators losing mounts for 40 days. The economic penalties that proved more effective than physical punishment in maintaining local support that mobile warfare required absolutely. The system of gifting robes of honor after successful operations expanded to recognize achievements in intelligence gathering, engineering, and medical service that traditional military hierarchies often overlooked. Pay scales reflected the economic reality of retaining experienced veterans whose battlefield knowledge had become irreplaceable. Horse archers received increases that recognized their strategic value in mobile operations, where cavalry effectiveness determined tactical outcomes, while specialists like engineers and medical personnel received bonuses that prevented the kind of desertion that could cripple entire operational capabilities. The silver dinars counted by weight, each mithqal representing roughly 4.25 grams, translated into daily survival for men whose loyalty depended on wages that arrived according to schedules they could depend on. The logistics of mobile warfare required completely different supply chain management than siege operations had demanded. Water discipline maintained the 3 to 4 litre capacity per cavalryman that experience had proven optimal, while fodder requirements for horses operating in mobile columns created transportation challenges that static siege warfare had never faced. Medical supplies were reorganized into portable kits that could travel with dispersed units, while communication systems adapted from siege signaling were modified for terrain where visual contact between formations might be impossible for extended periods. Intelligence networks developed during the siege were restructured for mobile operations that required different types of information gathering. The techniques for reading night sounds, frog choruses indicating water levels, absent dog barks suggesting enemy movement became standard reconnaissance procedures, while the visual signaling systems that had connected Acre's garrison with relief forces were adapted for coordinating cavalry operations across distances where trumpet calls couldn't carry. The human cost of transition revealed itself in details that official histories rarely recorded. Veterans showed psychological strain from months of siege warfare in ways that required careful management. Some had developed hypervigilance that made them valuable scouts but unreliable in formation fighting, while others had retreated into religious fatalism that made them fearless but difficult to control tactically. The process of transforming siege veterans into mobile warriors required training programs that rebuilt unit cohesion around completely different operational requirements. Can you imagine the psychological challenge of convincing 30,000 men that abandoning everything they had fought to defend was actually the path to ultimate victory? But intelligence arriving from Damascus carried news that would test every aspect of Saladin's strategic transformation. Reports about Crusader intentions that suggested Richard understood exactly how to exploit the advantages that Acre's capture had provided, and was preparing to do so with the same methodical precision that had reduced the city's walls to memory. For 2 years the sea had roared like a drum, and the ground had answered with iron. Acre was not merely a city under stones, but a furnace, where will was smelted to steel, and now Saladin understood that both victor and vanquished had emerged, transformed by fires that no man could have predicted when the first Crusader tents appeared on the horizon 34 months ago. The war that would follow Acre's fall demanded a complete reconceptualization of medieval warfare itself, where traditional siegecraft and defensive superiority gave way to mobile campaigns decided by technological innovation and logistical mathematics that few commanders had ever been forced to master. From his new position 7 to 15 kilometers inland, Saladin could see the smoke rising from Richard's camp and understand that the Crusader king represented more than military opposition. He embodied a systematic approach to warfare that treated conquest as an engineering problem, requiring mechanical solutions. The strategic lessons that emerged from 34 months of grinding siege warfare would influence military thinking for generations, but their immediate application required transformations that tested every aspect of Ayyubid institutional knowledge. The failure to crush the initial Crusader ring in 1189 had become a cautionary tale about allowing enemy bridgeheads to mature into permanent threats, while the success of Western siege engines in reducing supposedly impregnable walls demonstrated that static defense could no longer guarantee survival against enemies willing to invest in technological superiority. Saladin's personal transformation during the siege reflected broader changes in medieval political leadership that the intensity of prolonged warfare had accelerated. The Sultan who had emerged from Acre's ashes was harder, more pragmatic, and more willing to calculate human costs in the kind of mathematical terms that would have been unthinkable before experiencing the daily arithmetic of siege casualties. The dawn inspections that had become ritual during the siege riding muddy ramparts before first prayer, tasting flour from supply sacks to check for rot, continued in mobile camps, where attention to detail meant the difference between operational success and catastrophic failure. The economic audit of siege warfare revealed costs that extended far beyond immediate military expenditures into the structural foundations of the Ayyubid state itself. 34 months of maintaining 30,000 men in siege lines had required resource allocation that forced reductions in other theatres, delayed infrastructure projects, and created financial pressures that would influence policy decisions for years to come. The silver dinars counted by weight, each mithqal representing survival for men whose loyalty depended on wages, had accumulated into expenses that required taxation policies and administrative reforms that touched every corner of Saladin's empire. Cultural memory processing had already begun transforming Acre from tactical defeat into strategic narrative, with court poets comparing the city's stones to martyrs' ribs, while historians recorded lessons about the relationship between technological innovation and military effectiveness. The names of fallen emirs were being transformed into rhymed lists, suitable for evening recitations, creating shared cultural frameworks that maintained morale while acknowledging the human cost of prolonged warfare. The psychological function of this literary transformation extended beyond mere commemoration into the realm of institutional learning that would influence future strategic decisions. The technological revolution that Acre's siege had demonstrated required immediate responses that would reshape Ayyubid military procurement for the remainder of Saladin's reign. Counterweight trebuchets ordered from artisans in Aleppo and Hama represented more than weapons acquisition. They symbolized recognition that medieval warfare had entered a phase where technological parity was essential for survival against enemies who approached conquest as an engineering challenge requiring mechanical solutions. The tax relief promised to craftsmen who could deliver engines before the next campaign season reflected economic priorities that acknowledged technology's strategic importance. Medical innovations developed during the siege, counting pulses on prayer beads, rationing rosewater compressors, using ground pomegranate peel for specific wound types, became standard battlefield medicine that would travel with mobile armies rather than remaining confined to static hospital tents. The psychological techniques that had maintained morale during months of siege warfare were adapted for different stresses of mobile campaigning, where isolation and uncertainty replaced the grinding pressure of prolonged defensive operations. Surgeons who had learned to function under the constant threat of siege engines now faced different challenges in treating casualties from mobile warfare. The human cost of transformation revealed itself in details that military histories often overlooked, but commanders ignored at their peril. Veterans showed psychological adaptations to sustained combat that required careful management, hypervigilance, valuable for reconnaissance, but problematic in formation fighting, religious fatalism that produced fearlessness, but complicated tactical control, and combat exhaustion that accumulated over months of constant stress. The process of rebuilding these men into effective mobile warriors required training programs that acknowledged the psychological realities of what they had endured. Daily discipline measures that had evolved during the siege became permanent features of military organization that would define Ayyubid armies long after Acre's surrender. Water discipline maintaining 3 to 4 litre capacity per cavalryman, prohibition of looting within 20 kilometres of camp with economic penalties rather than physical punishment, and systematic rotation of command responsibilities to prevent local power accumulation all reflected lessons learned through bitter experience of what worked under pressure and what failed when tested by prolonged warfare. The intelligence networks developed during the siege provided frameworks for understanding enemy capabilities that would prove invaluable in mobile campaigns, where information gathering required different techniques but similar analytical approaches. Reading night sounds for tactical intelligence, coordinating visual signals across distances where verbal communication was impossible, and maintaining supply chain security in hostile territory, all represented institutional knowledge that transformed tactical defeat into strategic preparation for conflicts that everyone understood would continue regardless of Acre's fate. As sunset painted the Mediterranean sky the color of burnished copper, Saladin reflected on the mathematics of leadership that 34 months of siege warfare had taught him. Every decision carried consequences that rippled through networks of cause and effect, extending far beyond immediate tactical considerations, while the responsibility for lives lost and resources expended created psychological burdens that no amount of political success could entirely offset. The young commander who had conquered Jerusalem and shattered the Crusader host at Dartene had been replaced by a more complex figure who understood that victory and defeat were often separated by margins thinner than the edge of a Damascus blade. The final frame from Saladin's perspective would echo through the remaining years of his reign. Acre's loss was a wound, not a death blow, and preserving the field army still, tens of thousands strong with its cavalry corps intact, kept the 1191 to 1192 campaign season alive, with possibilities that tactical defeat had actually multiplied, rather than eliminated. The Sultan who rode away from Acre's smoking ruins carried with him lessons about warfare, leadership, and human endurance that would influence not just his remaining campaigns, but the entire trajectory of medieval military development. Can you imagine bearing the weight of such knowledge, understanding that every decision you made would be measured against the standard of 34 months, when the fate of civilizations hung in the balance between mathematics and will? The siege of Acre was over, but the war it had transformed was just beginning, and Saladin rode toward that future carrying the bitter wisdom that only defeat can teach about the true cost of empire, the mathematics of survival, and the terrible beauty of human endurance tested beyond all reasonable limits.